Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are looking at a really pivotal moment in 21st century geopolitics.
We are. The military intervention in Venezuela, the strikes, and then the capture of President Nicolás Maduro.
But we're not just looking at it as a headline, as an international incident. We're using the source material you shared with us. These articles on power dynamics, diplomatic cables, civil society reactions, to really analyze this as a critical case study in the struggle for sovereignty.
And specifically through a certain lens.
Right. Our focus today is how this intervention is viewed through the eyes of the global South and, well, especially Africa.
To even begin to understand the global reaction, we have to start in the concept that really frames this whole discussion, and that's neocolonialism.
Okay.
Historically, colonialism was direct rule, military, political, administrative control. Neocolonialism it's much more subtle. It's the continuation of control, but through indirect means.
So we're talking about things like economic leverage, conditional aid, maybe strategic loans, not troops on the ground holding flags.
Precisely. And a key figure here, really foundational, is Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana.
Right. A major voice in Pan-Africanism.
Exactly. And he had this really sharp definition. For him, neocolonialism was, and I'm quoting here, the last stage of imperialism.
The last stage. So what did he mean by that?
Well, his argument was that, political independence, having your own flag, your own elections, it's all basically meaningless if you don't have genuine economic independence.
Yeah.
He believed the controlled state has all the outward trappings of international sovereignty.
Okay, so it looks independent.
It looks independent, but in reality, its key economic and therefore its essential political policy is directed from the outside.
Okay, so let's unpack that tension, because that really is the heart of this deep dive. Our sources detail this very idea of indirect control, the subtlety. Yet the event we're looking at and the global reaction we documented from the UN to protests in Pretoria, it's all centered on a sudden, overwhelming, direct military action. So my core question is this. If neocolonialism is defined by its subtlety, how does this overt, very kinetic intervention in Venezuela, how does it reflect or maybe even evolve those patterns?
That's a huge analytical challenge.
Yeah.
And I think it suggests that when the indirect levers, sanctions, economic pressure, political isolation, when they fail.
When they don't get the desired outcome.
Exactly. The powerful state doesn't just abandon the goal of external control. It seems it just switches to the most direct, visible form of intervention possible. And then immediately it tries to normalize that action under a different name.
Let's start with that event itself, which, as you said, lacked any subtlety. We're talking about deadly U.S. strikes in Venezuela.
And the physical capture of the sitting president, Nicolás Maduro, and his wife, Celia Flores.
Who were then flown to the U.S. to stand trial on these long-standing criminal indictments.
And that military removal, that is the spectacular challenge to state sovereignty. When we talked about Nkrumah's definition, the key phrase was the outward trappings of sovereignty. Well, when a foreign power conducts an operation inside your borders to forcibly remove your head of state, it just strips away that trapping instantly, publicly. It shows that not only is your economy vulnerable, but your very political leadership is disposable.
But wait a second, if the whole point is control through subtle means, wouldn't the U.S. have been better off just sticking to sanctions and aid? Why risk this massive global condemnation, even from allies, with a messy, visible military operation that just screams invasion?
That's the critical strategic risk they took. And I think that the answer is in their legal justification. At the UN, the U.S. Ambassador Mike Waltz, he defended the attack by saying it was not an invasion. It wasn't an act of war.
So what was it then?
It was a legitimate law enforcement action. He argued the goal was just to execute these criminal indictments charges like narco-terrorism, which Maduro has always denied, against what they called an illegitimate leader.
So the key phrase was, we are not occupying a country.
That was the line. And that semantic shift is fascinating, isn't it? It tries to dodge all the condemnation that comes with regime change or violating sovereignty by just relabeling the act as global police work.
They're essentially trying to expand their own jurisdiction to the entire planet?
It's a profound attempt to normalize a breach of sovereignty. But that framing, it just collapsed immediately in the eyes of the global South.
Why?
Primarily because of what many observers see as the undeniable underlying motive.
Okay, let's follow that trail then. Let's look at the resource angle, because this is where that legal defense seems to have completely lost credibility, at least among the protesters.
Oh, absolutely.
The placards we saw in South Africa immediately link the intervention not to crime, but to resources.
And that connection is just foundational to the neocolonial critique. Venezuela has some of the world's largest proven oil reserves. It's no secret.
And people were direct about this.
Very. The South African Communist Party's Secretary General, Sauli Mapila, he was quite blunt. He said that President Trump had not hidden it to the world, that the U.S. intentions were to take Venezuela's oil reserves under their control.
So just like that, the narrative shifts. It goes from a law enforcement sweep against a supposed drug trafficker to a resource grab for economic domination.
And it connects directly to something called dependency theory, which really helps explain the structural vulnerability of a country like Venezuela.
Unpack that for us.
Well, dependency theory basically says the global economic system isn't just unequal, it's structured that way. You have wealthy center countries extracting resources, both human and natural, from poorer periphery countries.
And this forces those developing nations into a corner economically.
It does. As Che Guevara once put it, it forces them into a dangerous specialization in raw materials. They become reliant on a single product, the single market.
And for Venezuela, that single product is, of course, oil.
Exactly. Venezuela's overwhelming reliance on oil meant that controlling its access to global markets, its refining capacity, its pricing, all of that effectively gave outside powers a veto over the state's budget and stability.
So the state was economically vulnerable long before any military strike.
Long before. In this view, the military intervention is simply the final enforcement mechanism. It's what happens when a state refuses to play by the rules of that controlling economic system.
And, critics have a lot of historical parallels ready to go for this argument.
They do.
People like Nana J. Chaveri have framed other interventions, like the 2003 Iraq invasion, as petro-imperialism, actions motivated by securing control over vital oil reserves.
So for the Global South, the situation in Venezuela fits neatly into that pattern, regardless of what the official U.S. justification is. The irony is it's that the economic dependency fostered by these neocolonial practices is what makes the state weak enough for the direct military phase to even be possible.
Let's shift now to the diplomatic fallout, the emergency UN Security Council meeting. What was the global legal response to this idea of law enforcement being carried out by military force?
The UN meeting saw just widespread multilateral condemnation. Many nations explicitly called it a crime of aggression. The response was swift, and it was pretty far-reaching.
And what were some of the most pointed condemnations that came out of that session?
Well, Brazil's ambassador called the action an extremely dangerous precedent for the entire international community, a serious affront to sovereignty.
And Colombia. Their government has had strained relations with Maduro's.
Even Colombia's ambassador condemned it, called the unilateral use of force a violation of sovereignty and territorial integrity, and said it was reminiscent of the worst interference in our area in the past.
Wow. And I assume the permanent members, Russia and China, they predictably weighed in against the U.S. action.
Oh, they absolutely did. Russia denounced it as a turn back to the era of lawlessness. China claimed the U.S. had wantonly trampled upon Venezuela's sovereignty. They insisted no country can act as the world's police.
So on one side, you have the UN Charter. It obligates member states to refrain from the threat or use of force against another state.
And on the other, you have the U.S. defense.
Which is the legal dilemma.
It is. The U.S. ambassador invoked Article 51 of the UN Charter, which deals with self-defense, and, more controversially, cited the 1989 capture of Panama's Manuel Noriega as a legal precedent.
Okay, let's pause on that Noriega precedent. If the U.S. is using that as a justification, are we seeing an attempt by powerful states to normalize the erosion of sovereignty, to replace it with a new rule where they can just designate leaders as criminals and carry out cross-border arrests?
That is precisely how critics interpret it. Citing Noriega isn't seen as invoking a solid legal foundation. It's seen as referencing a past action that was also widely condemned as an invasion.
So the message to the Global South is?
The message is, we did it then, we can justify doing it now, and we get to define which of your leaders are legitimate enough to be protected by international law.
And yet, despite all this condemnation, the UN Security Council was, well, paralyzed.
Correct. The council was deadlocked. Any attempt to formally censure the U.S. was guaranteed to be blocked by a U.S. veto.
Which just highlights the structural weakness of the whole system.
It does. The rules exist in the Charter, but the enforcement mechanism, the veto power, it renders those rules moot for the 5 permanent members. It confirms the suspicion in the Global South of a two-tiered system of international law.
That paralysis must speak volumes to the countries of the Global South. So how did African nations, which are so historically attuned to these neocolonial dynamics, respond to this challenge to a fellow global South country?
For Africa, this was a clear and I think alarming demonstration of vulnerability. You have to see the reaction through the historical lens of African solidarity. Remember, the 1961 All-African Peoples Conference explicitly defined neocolonialism as the survival of the colonial system, in spite of formal recognition of political independence. For them, sovereignty isn't an abstract principle. It's the hard-won result of liberation struggles.
So what was South Africa's official position, given their prominence in their own history?
South African President Cyril Ramaphosa strongly condemned the capture. He emphasized South Africa's commitment to international law, the UN Charter, and expressed deep concern that the U.S. actions undermine the territorial integrity of a UN member state.
An unequivocal condemnation.
Absolutely. He demanded the immediate release of President Maduro and his wife. And even if, a unified African Union response is slow, this kind of statement from a key nation shows a profound regional anxiety. It triggers this deep historical trauma about external interference.
And we saw that anxiety mirrored on the ground in civil society.
We did.
In the protests outside the U.S. Embassy in Pretoria.
Yes. Protests led by the South African Communist Party, joined by others. They had placards demanding end American imperialism. But I think the most important takeaway came from one of the protesters, a woman named Sarah Mkwevo.
What did she say?
She articulated the core fear for the entire global South, which is the fear of precedent. Her statement was very succinct. She said, "Today it is Venezuela and Maduro. Tomorrow it can be any other smaller country that the U.S. is not happy with."
Wow.
And that just crystallizes the whole idea. If a powerful state can unilaterally define another head of state as a criminal and use military force to capture them, then the foundational principle that protects all less powerful nations' sovereignty is just. It's fundamentally undermined.
So we've really come full circle here. The core tension is this clash between national sovereignty, which is theoretically guaranteed, and powerful states claiming a unilateral right to law enforcement.
An action that critics argue is just a thin cover for regime change and strategic resource interests, like Venezuela's oil.
What's fascinating is that the intervention itself wasn't subtle at all.
Not in the slightest.
But the justification, this use of law enforcement and disputed legal precedent, that's the subtle 21st century mechanism. It's how a powerful state tries to maintain that neocolonial structure.
And the overwhelming rejection from the Global South shows they're not fooled by the legal semantics. They see a clear pattern of military intervention reinforcing economic control.
So the question we want to leave you with is this. Does powerful state intervention against a sovereign government, even if it's framed as a fight against an illegitimate leader, does it ultimately reinforce or challenge neocolonial concerns in Africa and the broader Global South by proving that sovereignty isn't a universal shield?
It really forces every developing nation to reevaluate the true limits of its legal independence.
Indeed. And for a final thought, consider this. Given the clear paralysis at the UN Security Council, what specific, actionable lessons should African policymakers draw from Venezuela's case about navigating external pressure? And maybe more importantly, how do they build local, regional resilience militarily and economically to deter these kinds of unilateral actions in the future? Thank you for taking this deep dive with us.